That's awesome. Thank you, Sean. Appreciate that. So you can see, Sean's been a member of the Power BI community for a long time, long time. Sean's spoken for us for a couple of times. And so you look out here, like we're in the Ventia office, you look out at the operations center out there, and it's like wall to wall Power BI, like you just see there's Power BI in use all the way through this organization. And so it's really cool to see the way they do that. And I'm sure, the whole, not just the way analytics is done, but then the whole data platform and how it's all working here is really, really cool. So that's a really great little insight into the stuff that's happening there. All right, let's move on to the main event. So we've got Rod Colledge from Microsoft. He's going to be presenting. Rod, can you hear me?
I can. Yes, I can hear you. Like I can't see the audience. I'm assuming there's thousands of people there in front
thousands.
of me.
There's thousands. There's throngs. There's throngs. Yeah. So, big round of applause for Rod. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everyone. And just to the point before on Ignite, so I've actually literally just come back from annual leave, and I was offline in Tassie. With first time down there. So to be honest, I've heard snippets of news from Ignite today, but probably not as up to date as what some of you are. But yeah, I might throw back to you, Greg, after I finish, and you can
no worries.
You can fill me in as to what's happened overnight. Yeah. So look. Thanks all, and good evening. It's been a little while since I've done one of these user group meetings. I used to do quite a few of them when I first started with Microsoft, way back in 2015. So in preparation for this one, I was actually thinking about some of the earlier ones that I did. And I might be showing my age here, but this was some of the stuff that I used to cover. So Performance Point Services was tremendous fun once you actually got it working. DataZen, if anyone remembers that was amazing. And Power Maps, I think I joked in my bio about breaking a video card on my laptop. That actually happened with Power Maps. So really cool visualizations, but it tended to break things, which was pretty amazing. And of course, all of these things are, I guess, precursors to what we have today with Power BI, which is, of course, the last mile, if you like, of a much longer journey preparing data, medallion architecture, all of that good stuff that we know. Power BI comes at the end. So if you think back a few years, if you were all in on Microsoft, the complete data pipeline might have looked something like this. So you've got your ingestion on the left-hand side there, maybe through Data Factory into the landing zone, and then you process that using PySpark, either Databricks or Synapse Spark, through Bronze, Silver, Gold. And then you push that out the other end to Power BI, maybe via Synapse Dedicated Pool, which some people consider, kind of the platinum zone. And then you've got your streaming layer across the top there as well. So all of that works fine, but there's a few challenges here. So there's different commercial models. So Power BI, as we know, is software as a service, whereas Synapse and things like Databricks, they're platform as a service. Some of those things there are serverless compute, some are provision compute. We have different storage formats. So in the data lake, we might have Delta format, but proprietary format in Synapse Dedicated Pool, and different user interfaces between those tools as well. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. So when we built Fabric a couple of years ago now, we wanted to address all of those things. And I guess the three key principles of Fabric are, firstly, it's all software as a service, like Power BI. So there's no clusters to spin up. You just pick a compute size or compute sizes, and away you go. Secondly, that compute is shared across all of those services, including Power BI. So you don't need to independently buy and size compute for each of these experiences. It's all shared. And thirdly, we unified the storage layer around open source Parquet Delta. So what this means is that we can mix and match things like Databricks compute with Fabric compute, because they both talk in the Delta format. So in this example, we might be using Data Factory and Fabric for low-code pipeline orchestration, Databricks for data engineering, and then Power BI for reporting and dashboards, with the storage layer in one lake. So there's no copying of data here. Data Factory, Databricks, and Power BI can all use the same Delta data, and we'll talk more about this as we go through. We also announced support for Iceberg, and there was definitely some Ignite announcements on this in terms of shortcuts overnight, which is an alternate open source storage format used by Snowflake. And that of course is made possible by our support for Xtable, the Apache Xtable project. So what this means is that you can mix and match compute over one lake with one copy of that data. So for example, you might have Snowflake writing in iceberg format, and then Databricks or Fabric reading that same data in Delta format. Without having duplicate copies of the data. So it really helps achieve, the holy grail that we've all kind of been driving towards, which is a single copy of the data, avoiding silos. So this is what we previously had. So you might buy a premium capacity just for Power BI. So for example, a P1 or a P2. And this is what we have today. So you buy a Fabric capacity. So for example, an F64, which covers everything, not just Power BI, but it also covers Power BI. So in terms of the agenda tonight, we're going to zero in on why we're doing this, how you do it, and what the benefits are, including the benefits for Power BI only users. So I speak to a lot of customers and they're like, okay, we're going to FSQs now, but all we really care about is Power BI. We're not going to use Fabric for anything. So what are the benefits for me in that scenario? So we'll cover that off as well. We're also going to cover this. So are Power BI reports and dashboards still relevant? And I kind of hinted at this in the intro to this session. So there was a Forrester report almost 3 years ago now, actually, which spoke about the post-dashboard world of BI being impactful and actionable and all of those words there. That same report actually mentioned that only about 20% of those making decisions are actually using BI tools, whether it's Power BI or something else. So what are the other 80% doing? So we'll look at some of the ways that moving from Power BI P to Fabric FSQs, we can move beyond dashboards to hopefully help that other 80% of people making decisions. So thanks for having me. My name's Rod, and as I mentioned earlier, I started at Microsoft way back in 2015. The year actually the Power BI was first released as a product. I'm based in Brisbane, and these days I spend most of my time covering Fabric, obviously, OpenAI, heaps of stuff happening there, Purview for data governance, and occasionally the odd SQL Server conversation, just like the old days. All right, so back in March earlier this year, so our VP released this blog post, which started talking about covering the licensing updates for Power BI. So the core point of this blog post was that we're discontinuing the Power BI Premium Capacity license and moving across to Fabric licensing for both Power BI and Fabric users. So in July, we stopped selling Power BI Premium Capacity licensing. And from January, so in about 2 months, you can no longer renew Power BI Premium Capacity that you may already have. So this is not a question of if, but when you have to go from P to FSQ. And I should add, nothing in Power BI changes other than licensing. So everything still works technically and functionally the same, but you now have a lot more options through the FSQ, which is what we're going to get into tonight. So in terms of the conversion, a Power BI P1 capacity is the equivalent of an F64, a P2 is an F128, and so on. But on the lower end, we can go all the way down to an F2 to reduce costs for dev test workloads, and we'll talk some more about that later. So in terms of moving from one to the other, you simply reassign workspaces from the P capacity to the new F capacity that you provision, and I'll show that in the demos. And you have a 90-day grace period after the PSKU capacity subscription has ended to access anything that you haven't moved across yet. And also just to point out, I was asked this when I did this presentation in Brisbane a few weeks ago, you still actually need a Power BI Pro license to publish Power BI reports to a workspace. So nothing changes there in terms of the Pro license. And in case I forget to mention this, you need a minimum of an F64 for Power BI and Fabric Copilots. And we'll talk more about Copilots a bit later as well. So for production workloads, what we recommend is that you at least have an F64. That gives you all of the feature benefits of Copilots, and you don't need Pro licensing for report consumers, which you do if you're on less than an F64. So the F2 to 32 capacities are really designed for those dev test workloads. And to be clear, you can buy multiple capacities and assign workspaces to the appropriate one. So you might have a dev test workspace on an F2, for example, and then prod on an F64 or above. And this also helps with chargeback scenarios as well. So if you're doing data mesh, this is really important. So business units can buy their own capacities and have their workspaces placed on them, just like you could with Power BI P capacities. One more quick thing on the commercials before we get into some more technical stuff. So unlike the Power BI capacities, you can provision Fabric capacities as either pay-as-you-go or as a reserved instance. So Power BI Premium was a 12-month reservation only. So this gives you a lot of flexibility for handling temporary or spiky workloads. And as I mentioned before, the general recommendation is reserved instances for the base load and then pay-as-you-go for temporary or spiky workloads above that. And one other thing as well, the pricing for Fabric is region specific. So in the calculator or through the portal, which we'll look at in a minute, you might see different pricing for Fabric depending on which region you're in, unlike Power BI, which was a universal US dollar cost regardless of where your tenancy was. All right, and just to be clear, you can have more than one Fabric capacity that I mentioned earlier to support things like chargeback in a decentralized mesh. So if we imagine we have 3 departments, as per this example, we have sales, marketing, and finance. So each of those departments might have their own Fabric workspaces, just like you could have had with Power BI workspaces. And each of those are assigned to a particular Fabric capacity, and I'll show this in the demo. So in the case here, sales has got its own dedicated capacity, but then marketing and finance share a capacity which enables those chargeback scenarios. But they all store their data in one lake, and subject to permissions, the data products they create can be endorsed and shared without having to copy data around. In the case of multinational deployments of Fabric, just to call this out quickly, so each workspace is assigned to a capacity which may be allocated in a specific region. So in this case here, we have a Fabric capacity in Europe and another one in the US, and then workspaces are assigned accordingly. So this supports things like data residency requirements, GDPR, but also for high performance to minimize latency for multinational deployments, as I mentioned. All right, so from an overall architecture perspective, if you're all in on Azure, you might have had something like this that we covered earlier. So ingestion using Data Factory, PySpark for transformation, and then serving to Power BI, maybe via Synapse, dedicated or serverless. So if we move to the Fabric architecture, we still have to do each of those things. So the question is, well, what are the benefits of moving to Fabric? So we've touched on this briefly, but the main one is the capacity that you provision can be used for any part of that pipeline. So you can use the capacity for ingestion using Data Factory, Spark for transformation, and then Power BI for consumption. You also have a single monitoring dashboard across the whole pipeline. Unlike Power BI capacity, you can scale the Fabric capacity up and down and pause the capacity. So this is great for spiky workloads. You couldn't pause Power BI capacity. And then finally, we introduced the concept of bursting and smoothing, which is essentially being able to size for the average instead of the peak, the overnight peak in batch, for example, which gives you a lot more flexibility. So if you consider how we used to size workloads in the past, so let's say, for example, we had an overnight batch process that processes data and you need to complete before 8 a.m. as an example, when users start using Power BI reports. So in that scenario, you'd need to provision enough compute capacity to ensure the overnight process completes on time. With Fabric, we have the concept of bursting and smoothing. So you can provision, say, for example, an F64 capacity. We'll actually let you use more than that to complete the job. And the extra compute you use will then be smoothed out over the following day. So you no longer need to size for the peaks. You can size for the average, which provides a lot of flexibility commercially. So I'll put a link in the chat window which describes how this works, but essentially it happens over a 24-hour period and there's guardrails in place. So with no smoothing at all, you might have a job that takes, let's say, for example, 3 hours on an F8 capacity. If we take away all of the guardrails, that same job could complete in 5 minutes on a much higher capacity, which is awesome, but then everything would be throttled for the next day. With guardrails in place, that same job completes in about 30 minutes with no throttling for about 4 hours, which is a good blend between those two. So for those familiar with Power BI Auto Scale, this is kind of similar, but it applies to any Fabric workload. So for example, a PySpark data engineering pipeline. The other difference is that with Power BI Auto Scale, once you scaled, that stayed in effect for 24 hours and you paid for 24 hours. So with Fabric, if you scale up temporarily, there's no charge at all because the overuse will be smoothed out over the next day's lower use period. So it's a much better commercial outcome. All right, a couple of other key points. If you have a Azure commitment or MAC, as we refer to them, your Fabric spend draws down on that, unlike Power BI capacity spend, as it wasn't technically considered an Azure service. I previously mentioned the choice of reservation model as well as pay-as-you-go to get the best price performance blend, unlike Power BI, which is reservation only. I also mentioned that you can scale all the way down to an F2 SKU, which is 32 times smaller than the minimum Power BI capacity, which is great for those test dev workloads. And there's also some Azure-only features in Fabric as well, such as trusted workspace access to storage accounts behind firewalls from Fabric shortcuts that are only available on Fabric SKUs and not Power BI SKUs. All right, so what about if you're a Power BI only customer and you don't really have any interest in any of the other stuff that Fabric brings? So for those customers, there's still 3 key benefits. As I mentioned, you can scale down to a much smaller size. So all the way down to an F2, which is 32 times smaller than the previous smallest Power BI premium capacity of P1. Again, great for dev test. You have the option as pay-as-you-go now with FSKUs. Previously, you had to commit to a full year with a Power BI premium PSKU. And we also have the option now of direct lake mode in Fabric, which could reduce the impact on the source system. So as we know, before Fabric, these were the 2 options for Power BI reports. We had direct query mode, which always got the latest copy of the data from the source. So it was good for recency, but there was a performance impact because every time we had to go back to the source to get the data. Then we had import mode, which caches a copy of the data in Power BI memory, which is great for performance, but it's not up to date. So with Fabric now, and Power BI users can take advantage of this on an FSKU, we have direct lake mode. So essentially it's a blend of both of those. So we're always reading the source in the Parquet Delta files. So it's kind of like direct query in that sense. But because it's in Parquet format, which is columnar compressed, we have similar performance to import mode. And there's caching there as well, which I'll talk about in the demos. So we kind of get the best of both worlds. All right, before we jump into the demos, I just wanted to talk about direct lake mode with mirroring. So if we focus on the left part of the diagram that's circled there, so you'll see that we support mirroring source systems, including Azure SQL Database and Cosmos, into OneLake. So what this does under the covers is read the change data capture endpoint of those source systems and write the data in Parquet Delta format in OneLake. And then you can use that in direct lake mode to Power BI reports, as I mentioned before. So there's a couple of benefits in doing that. So firstly, we reduce the impact on the source system from Power BI direct query because we're now reading a mirrored copy in OneLake. And we also avoid the need to develop ingestion pipelines. The other thing to call out here is data quality. So anything that lands in OneLake can now be analyzed for data quality using the new Purview Data Governance data quality feature. So as well as offloading impact on the source systems for reporting, we can also use that mirrored data for data quality checks. And if you're using that data to ground AI models, obviously data quality is pretty critical. All right, so that's a whole lot of talking before I do some demos. So let's jump in now and have a look at the demos. All right, so the first thing I just wanted to start with is just how to provision Fabric capacity. So this is my Azure portal here. Let me just move that out of the way. So I've gone in to the Azure portal. I've created a new Azure resource. I've chosen the Fabric capacity as the type. And then down here, we can choose the size after I choose my resource group and so forth and the region. If I click on change size, you can see the different fabric size options. So we have an F2 SKU for $262 a month, all the way up to an F2048 at $270,000 a month. So if everyone can go and spin up a few of those, that'd be awesome. And as I mentioned before, depending on what region you're in, I'm in West US 2. You might notice some of the pricing differences there. So just to be aware of that. So that's the process of spinning up the capacity. If I have a look at an existing capacity that I've spun up, this one will come up, and you'll be able to see that we have the pause option here. So this is an F8 SKU at the moment. I can click on change size to change that to any of the other sizes, and I can also pause that. So we can burst above an F8, as I mentioned before, with the bursting and smoothing for that 24-hour period that I mentioned, or I can just permanently change the size to be much larger or smaller, and I can also pause that. So that was the first thing that I just wanted to point out. The other thing is the Power BI admin portal. So if you've got admin rights, you can come into the portal, and the first thing you can do here is choose whether or not you actually want your users to be able to create fabric items. So customers that are using other things for data engineering, like Databricks, for example, when they move to Fabric, they might want to have a think about, well, what Fabric features are we going to let users do? So the first thing you can do is just turn that off completely. So this is effectively just Power BI now, even though it's an F SKU. So you can disable Fabric other than Power BI, or you can selectively choose which entry groups you want to let create fabric items. And then you can also choose this option here, capacity admin. So if you have multiple fabric capacities, you can selectively choose, well, what capacities can you create fabric items on? So you can be quite granular in that sense. The other thing, just while I'm here, is to go down to the workspaces. So the process of actually moving a Power BI workspace from a P SKU to an F SKU, you can come into the admin portal, choose the workspaces, and then come in here to the workspace and choose reassign. And that's where you can choose to reassign it from a Power BI premium capacity or whatever else it is to a fabric capacity. And if you've got more than one fabric capacity, you can choose which workspaces to move. We've also got scripts to automate this as well. So if you're a very large Power BI customer with hundreds or thousands of workspaces, rather than having to click all through this, you can have a script to automate that process. All right, so just a couple of things to point out there. All right, so for the rest, what I did for this demo and some of the other ones that I've done, which you may have seen, is I went to Kaggle. For those that aren't familiar, Kaggle's a great resource if you're looking to just get some test data sets to build up some demos. This is the one that I use for this this session. So it's synthetic transactions for a retail type scenario. So effectively, it's credit card transactions across each of these categories here. So if we scroll down, you can see the size. That's about 23 gig uncompressed. I think there's about 260 million transactions across a time period. Start date of the transaction, the spend category, the location, and so forth. So that was the data set that I used. All right, so if we jump into Fabric now and do the demo, this is the landing page for Fabric. If you haven't seen it, there's a bunch of stuff you can do here. There's recommended content, so I can start creating data lakehouses and Power BI reports. What a lot of people do is go down to the OneLake Data Hub, and this is kind of where you can discover the content that's already in your Fabric tenancy. So on the left-hand side here, I can see all of the workspaces that I have access to, and then the different products that are on those workspaces. I can also do things like, well, only show me data products that have been endorsed. So you can kind of have that data mesh type scenario. So data products that start their life in a workspace, then they become endorsed for use throughout the organization. What I'm going to start with here today is just go down to my data lakehouse. And the first thing I'll point out here is the zip file, so from Kaggle. So effectively what I did was download that file and then upload that into Power BI, into my OneLake. There's a couple of different ways you can upload it. You can write a data factory pipeline to ingest, or you can just go up here and click on Get Data and upload files. or you can write a notebook. So this was the zipped file that I uploaded. Then I wrote a simple data factory pipeline to unzip that into that transactions.csv file. Now, you might have noticed these tables up here on the left-hand side. So what I actually did was write a PySpark notebook to read that CSV file and then effectively process it back out to the data lake as a Parquet file. And then this line of code here in PySpark actually then saved that as a managed table. So if we go back here, you can see that was the zip file, that's the CSV file. It then wrote that as a Parquet and then effectively started creating these managed tables. So that's kind of the process end to end. Now, the thing to point out here with Fabric is that what we automatically do with every lakehouse, so this is a lakehouse, it's got a range of different content, is we automatically create a semantic model for you as well as a SQL endpoint. So if you think about what we had to do in the past, you might have had a CSV file. What we would typically do is then open that in Power BI Desktop. We'd do some data modeling and then deploy that to the Power BI service, and then we can start creating reports on that. So what we do in Fabric is that as soon as you land data in the lake, we automatically expose effectively a semantic model. Now, you can choose which tables to include in that model by creating a custom semantic model, which is what I've done here. So I've just chosen these particular tables here. And you can see the tables that we have. If I click on Open Data Model, what I'll be able to see is the relationships that we have there. If I click on one of those tables, I can then go over here to Advanced, and I can see that the storage mode for that is the direct lake mode that we spoke about before. All right, the other thing I just wanted to point out is around caching. So if I go back to my workspace here and go down to the semantic model and go into the settings for that, there's one thing to point out. If you go down to the refresh area here, you'll notice by default, this setting is turned on. So keep your direct lake up to date. So what Power BI will do is that it will detect any changes to the underlying Parquet Delta files, and it'll automatically refresh that into the Power BI memory space. Now, if, for example, you know that the Databricks pipelines or PySpark pipelines in Fabric only update the data once a day, what you can do is turn that off and then effectively configure a refresh schedule, which is kind of similar to the import mode that we used to have. But by default, that is turned on, which means as soon as any of the Parquet Delta changes, it'll automatically be available in Power BI without you having to do a scheduled refresh like we used to do with Power BI previously. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so then the other thing, now that we've got this data model, so we didn't have to do Power BI data sets in desktop, we didn't have to deploy anything, we just landed data in the lake. Automatically, we have a semantic model. And then we can go up the top here, click on Explore, and we can automatically create a report. So Fabric will just look at the data model and go, this is probably what I think you want to do. Or we can create a blank report from scratch, which is what I did. And then I created this report, which is effectively visualizing those transactions. So you can see this is just a basic report. We've got a chart here of visualizing the transactions by category. And then we've got some slices up the top here, so I can do all of the classic things like slice and dice by the transaction date. Now, this is actually reading the Parquet Delta files directly in OneLake using direct lake mode, but you can see the performance. So this is 262 million transactions, and I'm just slicing that using the slices. I can pick a particular customer ID, and you can see the performance of that. So 262 million, not massive, but it's big enough to give you the feel for how good this performance is. Now, the other thing is this data in the lake. In my case, I uploaded a zip file and then created a Parquet version of that. If you were to use mirroring from a SQL database, for example, one of the things that we do under the covers when we mirror the data from the CDC endpoint into OneLake is we automatically write it as Parquet format, which then means it automatically becomes available in the semantic model. So what that means is that you're doing all of this without having to write any pipelines to ingest it. It's there automatically through mirroring, and we're also not impacting on the source system because it's mirrored. So it's near real time within Fabric. All right. So so this is all well and good, but if you think back to the thing I mentioned at the start of this presentation, which is, what's the relevance of Power BI reports these days? One of the clients that I talk to tells me every time I speak to them that Power BI reports are so frequent in their organization. It's kind of like waking up to an email inbox with thousands of unread emails. It's like, oh God, this is too much. What am I going to look at here? So we absolutely recognize that. And there's a couple of things that I just wanted to point out. At a very basic level, what you can do here is go to any of these visualization areas and click on the little set alert button. And you can choose to be notified when whatever measure of interest on the report exceeds a certain threshold that you specify. So in this case here, I might say, well, when the sum of the amount, in this case 21 billion, exceeds a certain value, so becomes greater than a value. So I might say when it exceeds 25 billion, send me an email or send me a Teams message. We can also do things like call a custom REST endpoint. We can do things like execute a Power Automate flow. So we can, or which might raise a ServiceNow ticket, however you choose to do that. So effectively what we're doing is moving from a world where you wake up, you go to your Power BI dashboard, you look for something of interest, and then you might make a decision. That's too hard, too slow. No one does that anymore. Some people do, but not everyone wants to do that. So we're moving now towards this, which is kind of like management by exception, where you can say, this is what I need to know. When it happens, just do something. Send me an email, raise a ServiceNow ticket, whatever that is. Just so, in other words, take action on that without me having to go and look at the dashboard or look at the report. So that's good, but this is still batch mode stuff here, right? So we're still reliant on data coming into the lake, being processed through medallion architecture before it lands in the Power BI report. So what if I want to follow that same principle, but I want it to be as close as possible to when that data happens in the source system? How do we do that? So that's where we get into real-time intelligence in Fabric. So what I've done here, I've got a second demo environment here, and I've clicked on the real-time hub. So before, when I showed you the OneLake Data Hub, this is for the classic Power BI stuff, so reports and lakehouses and so forth. What I've done here is click on the real-time hub. And what I can do here is start ingesting data from near real-time sources. So for example, it could be IoT Hub, Event Hub. You'll also notice change data capture sources here as well. So for example, if you're using Cosmos or Postgres, you can be reading directly from the CDC endpoint into that near real-time stream. So once you tap into a source, we can then start building what's called event streams. And this is an event stream. So essentially what we do is we have the source, in this case, and it's an event hub, and then we can do stream processing. Now, if you think about what we showed before, we had a Kaggle file of transactions. We landed it in the lake. We wrote some PySpark to do some transformations. We push that out to Power BI. This is similar, except it's not happening on the data lake. It's happening in the stream, so in memory stream. Now, this particular example here we're looking at is a retail store example. So we have sensors in the store which measure the temperature in the store and other things like the amount of traffic passing by and so forth. So what we're doing in the stream here is we're ingesting from the event hubs. You can see the data down the bottom here. So the device ID, the city, the store, you can see the battery level of the sensor and the temperature. This is in Fahrenheit. Then we're doing things like we're renaming some of the columns and then writing that out to the lakehouse. And when you do that, it writes it into Parker Delta format. You can also do other things in the stream. So for example, we might filter this stream to pick a particular city, in this case Miami, and then write that out to a dedicated stream. So someone else can then come in and say, okay, well, just give me all of the Miami data, and they can start at this point without having to do the filtering. You'll also see this stream at the top here, which is basically writing to a Custo database. So Custo, for those that aren't familiar, is essentially our time series optimized database. So effectively, it's stored in a format that enables querying billions or trillions of events in near real time. So we actually use Custo internally at Microsoft for our security threat monitoring. So for everything from transactions in store to Xbox events to M365 events and so forth. So you can imagine the amount of data that we're ingesting, literally trillions of events per day, is stored in that Custo format, and then we can do near real-time reporting on that. So in this case here, we were writing to the Lakehouse in Parquet format. This is a special format optimized for near real-time. The other thing you can do in the stream is do transformations. So if I have a look at this one here, for example, we might do aggregates in tumbling windows. So for example, one of the columns that's coming in from the sensor is the temperature sensor in Fahrenheit. So what we're doing here is saying in a 5-second tumbling window, give me the average temperature for the last 5 seconds. And then we're writing that back out. And you'll also notice something here called resale store, which has a little lightning bolt, and that's what we call reflex. And I'll come to that in a second. I just wanted to talk about the Custo database in a little bit more detail. So one of the things we can do once we've written the data to the KQL database or the Custo database is then start querying that. And in this case here, this is KQL, by the way. So if you think about T-SQL as, select star from table, KQL is a little bit different. So this is the table name. And when I say table, I'm talking about the in-memory representation of that data. So it's the thermostat table. And then we're doing things like project and summarize, which is really like group bys and aggregates. So it's kind of similar to a T-SQL statement, but written a bit differently. Now, how I actually created this query was I clicked on Copilot and I did this. So I just put in that comment there in Copilot, and we'll talk more about Copilot in a second, but I just pasted that in there. And then Copilot actually generated that KQL for me. So it understood what I wanted to do from a natural language. It read the data model effectively of the stream, and then it created that query for me. And then I just clicked on insert, which created that data there. And you can see then that the data is coming through from that query. Now, what I can do now is click on pin to dashboard. Now, when I say dashboard, kind of like a Power BI dashboard, but these are real-time or near real-time dashboards. So this data here is now coming directly from the in-memory stream. So it hasn't landed anywhere other than the KQL database, which is time series optimized, and we're reading that directly. Up the top here under manage, I can click on refresh rate and I can have that continuously refreshing as it comes in, or I can schedule the refresh. And then effectively, if you have like an operations center type scenario, you can have this dashboard up on a big screen, and then the data will be updated in real time. Now, the other thing you can do is click on this lightning bolt here and click set alert. Now, this is where I was going before. So we spoke about here before with the Power BI report that we had. So if I go back to that report and I clicked on the little bell and I said, when this happens, notify me. So this is effectively the same thing, but this is now happening on the stream data. So for example, if we're dealing with, let's say, a refrigeration truck, which is transporting medicine, which has to be stored at a particular temperature, if the truck refrigeration breaks down, that's really bad because there could be, millions of dollars worth of product which might spoil. So in this case here, what I've done is set up this reflex event to say when the average temperature becomes greater than or equal to 71 Fahrenheit, let me know. Now, let me know can be an email message, it could be a Teams message, or I can choose a custom action. Now, if I choose custom action, this is where we can do things like invoke a Power Automate workflow, which might, for example, raise a ServiceNow ticket, email someone, and then invoke a REST API endpoint to set off an alarm somewhere in the warehouse. So effectively what we're doing is we're saying, we don't want to wait for the data to land and be processed in Medallion. That's too late. We need to know in near real time when things happen. So what we did was we started with the the event stream, we ingested the data from Event Hub, we went through the processing in the stream, and then we might have a reflex action at the end of that, which listens for certain events and then takes action in real time. So if we think back all the way back to the start of the presentation when we spoke about the IDC report or the Gartner report, can't remember which one it was, where we spoke about 80% of people making decisions don't make those decisions using BI tools. So what things can we do in Fabric now to help that 80%? So that's a couple of little things that we can do within Fabric, such as near real-time alerts. So as soon as something happens, do something without anyone ever opening up a BI tool effectively. And that functionality is available through the F SKU once you convert across from P to F in Fabric. All right, I'll go back to slides just to cover off a few other little things. Let me go back here for a second. Hopefully this is all making sense. I'll make sure I leave time at the end for feedback and comments as well. So that's effectively what we spoke about there with the demo for the near real time. So ingesting data from source, whether it be a CDC endpoint, Event Hub, IoT Hub, into the event stream where we can do some aggregates and so forth. That can go to an event house, which is KQL effectively. So the near real time column time series optimized database, and then the reflex actions, which is effectively if this happens, then do that. Now, I just wanted to point out something here. There is also an anomaly detection private preview. So what we did in the demo there was say, if the temperature goes beyond 71, let me know. So that's me having to identify something of interest and then choose what to do. But the other common thing is, for those familiar with Donald Rumsfeld, the unknown unknowns. What happens if I just don't know what it is that I don't know? But we can use things like anomaly detection for Fabric to automatically listen to the stream and basically predict when something falls outside of the normal operations. So effectively, the anomaly detection will listen to the stream. When something goes beyond the normal operations, it can take action automatically without you having to define what that event is. So that's in public preview. Sorry, private preview. All right, copilots. So we had a little look at Copilot there with the KQL generation. You're probably familiar with some of the Copilot stuff we've been able to do in Power BI Desktop for a while, like generating DAX, which is very handy from time to time if you're doing some complex DAX calculations. The other thing you can do, and hopefully I've shared my screen with sound, is some more complex type Copilot stuff. So I'm just going to play this video and hopefully the sound is going to come through. So let me play this now.
Next generation AI in Microsoft Fabric empowers you to unlock the full potential of your data. With Copilot integrated into every data experience, Microsoft Fabric lets you use natural language to bring your data to life. From integrating data to writing code to finding insights and creating reports, new transformative AI experiences work alongside you every step of the way, so you can stay focused on getting value from your data. Copilot helps turn your words into data flows and data pipelines, so you can intelligently integrate data from anywhere. When writing code, Copilot automatically suggests code and entire functions in real time. And Copilot can guide you to create machine learning models to unlock insights in your data. Just by chatting with Copilot, you can visually explore your data to create stunning reports, discover insights, and summarize your data into easy-to-understand text narratives for sharing. With Copilot, you can turn insight into action with triggers that monitor your data and notify users. You can even create your own custom natural language experiences that combine Azure OpenAI models and your organization's data, and easily publish your creations as plugins. And with your data in Fabric, Copilot provides insights and answers everywhere work gets done. Most importantly, Microsoft Cloud runs on trust.
All right, so hopefully that makes sense. That's some of the Copilot capabilities in Fabric. The one thing to point out there, I think I mentioned this earlier, you need at least an F64 to have access to the Fabric Copilots. Anything below that, you won't have, and you don't need to have your own OpenAI stuff on Azure for that. Fabric will automatically do all of that under the covers, and the actual compute used in those copilots will basically come from whatever capacity you have. So if you have an F64 and you're smashing Copilot all day long, it'll be drawing down on that capacity. So that is an additional consumer of the capacity that you provision.
Next.
All right, so just a couple of things to wrap up, again, in that beyond reporting space. So earlier we looked at Data Activator, which is one of the ways of dealing, with the always going to dashboard problems. So for example, listen to a stream of data and tell me when I need to know something. So this is effectively that management by exception scenario. So rather than look at dashboards, just tell me when something goes wrong via email or Teams, and then invoking a downstream business process. I won't play the next video, but you may have seen a bit of a hint in the previous one where the Q&A experience. So basically what you can do now is effectively in your Fabric Lakehouse, you might have 50 tables. Let's say, for example, you've got a sales table. You can choose that sales table and create a Q&A experience over the top and then deploy that to an endpoint to let people talk to it. So this is an example of what I did. So in that spend scenario that I had, so I chose the 3 tables, so dim customers, dim expense, and fact transactions. So I selected those tables and then created this Q&A experience. And then I could just ask questions. So for example, what was the total spend for clothing in April 2016? And it's come back with not just the answer, but it's also giving me the T-SQL that it used to generate that answer. Over on the right-hand side there in the notes for model, if you're familiar with prompt engineering, this is effectively where you can inject that prompt engineering. So you can see I wrote there, so when returning aggregates on the amount column, round to the nearest whole number. So you can do stuff like that. So this is effectively an OpenAI experience over Lakehouse in Fabric, where you've selectively chosen tables. We've got some prompt engineering there, and it's using the GPT-4o model under the covers. Just to prove that that's accurate, so this is the Power BI report screenshot. I've chosen April. I've clicked on clothing, and you can see there the sum in the Power BI report matched the answer that came back, which is always nice. Then once you've created that, you can then deploy that to an API endpoint. So effectively what you can do here is you've got your Fabric Lakehouse, you've created the OpenAI Q&A, and then you can deploy that as a package solution to an endpoint, which then means you can then embed that inside an application or a Teams channel or however you choose to embed that. So again, to the point of how do we stop users going to dashboards every morning and looking for something, this is just one of the other ways that we can kind of operationalize the data using Fabric functionality. All right, I'm going to finish with something a little bit controversial as a Microsoft person. This is Google Notebook LM. Some of you may be familiar with this. I'll just play a video very quickly to give you an idea. Actually, not a video, the actual Notebook LM solution itself. So this is effectively taking what I built in Power BI as a PDF. I loaded it into Notebook LM and then just click play, which generates a podcast. So I'm just going to play this now.
Okay, so get ready, everybody, because today we are going deep on spending habits.
Ooh, fun.
Yeah. So we've got some pretty interesting data here.
Okay.
All right, I won't subject you to the whole thing because it goes on for 7 minutes. I'll just go to a random point and you should be able to get the idea of what's happening here.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, so it's like the bar graph gives us the big picture, and then spend.pdf is going to zoom in and give us all those juicy details.
I like.
Okay, so effectively what that is using Gen AI over the top of data to generate a podcast. So I'm going to finish with these 2 slides and then I'm going to stop talking. So effectively we've taken that same concept and we've put this into a GitHub repo where you can basically reproduce that, but in a secure manner behind private endpoints, all of that good stuff that you'd expect with a secure deployment. So under the covers, what that will do is use document intelligence to crack open PDFs and kind of deconstruct the data. It uses GPT-4o, which is a multimodal model, and then Azure AI Speech to then generate the podcast hosts, which will then generate that conversation over what your data is. Now, one of the ways that our customers have actually taken that idea and brought that to life is Vista Group in New Zealand. So effectively what these guys are doing is using that GitHub repo. What they've done is take their sales data, generate the podcast. So as the execs drive into the office every morning, they're listening to the podcast of their sales data in the car as they drive to work. So again, back to my point before about how do we go beyond opening up dashboards and reports and all of that old boring stuff into using some of the more modern Fabric things to kind of bring the data to life. All right, that's it for me. I know we covered a whole lot there. The intent here was to make you aware of all of the cool stuff you can do once you've converted from Power BI P SKUs to Fabric F SKUs, and there's a lot here. These are some of the things that we've covered. If we then extend that to services like OpenAI, you can then really transform what used to be fairly boring reports into something, I think is truly next level. And Data Activator and the podcasts are certainly great examples of that. All right, Greg, back to you.
Well, thank you, Rod. That was awesome. The podcast thing. I discovered Notebook LM, furiously generating podcasts on all sorts of different things. It's pretty cool. Now, there's a question on the chat for you, Rod. So Shelley had a question.
Does Copilot read the data or just the semantic models, table structures? What are the PII implications? But will the AI? Okay, so answer the first one first. So Copilot will read the semantic model, and it will understand what the question is enough to generate the code, whether it's Python or T-SQL, to query the data and return it, if that makes sense. So it's not reading the data directly, it's reading the semantic model to generate the code. Will the AI podcast ask me to rate and subscribe? Yeah, like and subscribe.
Awesome. I've got two questions from that presentation. The first one is, if I'm a Fabric person and I buy 2 F32s, do I get Copilot?
I saw that question asked earlier today. I'm pretty sure the answer is no. Each capacity that Copilot exists on has to be an F64 or above.
That's what I thought, but I was just hoping.
I will confirm that and drop it back into the chat window once I've confirmed.
Is there a price difference between 2 F32s and a F64? I don't think there is. No, I think it'd be about the same. Yeah.
It's the same. It's a linear.
Yeah, interesting. The other one I had was when you did the alert on the Power BI report. Does that generate an artifact in like Data Activator, or is that like separate to that?
It generates a Data Activator artifact.
Yeah.
To do. Cool.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. And so whether you do that through Power BI with using the bell, or whether you do it in a stream, for example, and in an event stream. So either way, it'll generate a Data Activator artifact. Yep.
Yeah. Cool.
Question for you, Rod. Copilot, the resources that is being used by Copilot, it is actually considered for your bursting and smoothing as well.
Correct. Yeah, and anything that uses the Power BI capacity, the Fabric capacity, I should say, is subject to bursting and smoothing. Yeah.
And that bursting and smoothing itself, it's a 24-hour block, like a moving block is trying to figure itself out. Like,
yeah,
it seems to be a strange concept. Like you're almost buying future resources.
Yeah, let me go back to where the slide was, which is this one here. What I'll do is I'll put a link in the chat window now, which talks about that.
So see how you've got the 24 hours moving. Is that when it's sort of like kicks in, where it basically goes, all right, you've gone past your compute. It's going to try to smooth it using future resources
Yeah.
for 24 hours.
Yeah. So this is the blog post which talks about it in detail. So effectively, what happens is, and I think it actually gives a detailed example of how that works. But effectively, yeah. So if we look at this here, so this is if we have an F8, for example, right? So whatever you're doing, let's say it takes 3 hours to run an F8. If we take away all of the guardrails, then that same thing might burst to a F294 equivalent and complete in 5 minutes, but then effectively it's used all of the capacity for the next 24 hours, so nothing can happen after that point. So you'd need to increase the capacity that you have. So what we do instead is we put some guardrails around it so it can burst for a small amount of time, but not too much to the point where it's going to completely lock you out.
So I guess the question there is the 24 hour, is that in a calendar day, or is that when you first spike?
I believe it's for the next 24 hours after that first spike occurs.
All right, thanks.
Yep.
Hang on, one more question. I'm going to them.
Yeah, I'll ask the question, but to answer that question, there's another link on the Microsoft one which talks about the throttling, where it limits how much it will burst and it will smooth. So there will be some errors if you hit those limits. So there'll be, it's in that linked article from there. My question is on if you are using less than F64 SKUs and companies who are heavily using Power BI, but not the other components, they have like other data warehousing solutions. So in that case, they still need pro license for reading and developing.
Yeah. So there's no changes to the requirement for Power BI Pro licenses. So let's say, for example, you have an F256, like a really big Fabric capacity. You still need Pro licenses to be able to publish reports to workspaces backed by that capacity. If you go below an F64, so let's say, for example, you have an F8, reports on that capacity, you'll need a Pro license to both read and write effectively.
So if you're not using Fabric features like the Lakehouse and the data engineering and the other features, just the Power BI reporting, there's no need to switch to an FSKU. You can just stick with your Pro licenses.
Are you saying if you don't have a premium capacity at all at the moment, if you just have purely Pro? Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But if you do have a premium capacity like a P1, then from January next year onwards, you can't renew a P1.
Yeah, that's going.
You have to convert. But yeah, if you're not using any premium capacity at all, then there's no chance. You just continue with the Pro licenses or premium per user licenses. Yep.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions? Any questions online? Put them in the chat. Otherwise, I think that might be about it. All right. Hey, I just want to quickly call out for the people in the room. That was Bryson from Serious People. He paid for the pizza and then he had to go. So but he did feed us. Oh, wait, we've got a question. I'm going. Hang on.
Yeah, hi, Rod. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. With the data model, what if some of the fields had different values? Like, for example, customer, like in one table it was customer, another table it was client, right? Mm-hmm. So does the data model, will it work? Will it figure it out, or with fuzzy logic, or if the fields are different? Yeah.
So remember, under the covers, it's effectively using GPT tech to do this. So in the same way, so it's all vectorized effectively, right? So if you ground a LLM on a PDF and then you start asking questions of the PDF, you don't have to be exact in the way you ask the questions, because it'll vectorize the question and match the appropriate parts of the PDF document. So in the same way, what we're doing here is we're grounding the LLM on your semantic model. So if the LLM thinks that clients and customers are really the same thing, it'll be smart enough to figure that out.
Awesome. Cool. All right. I think that will be. I'm walking downstairs. Oh my god, this it's like an auditorium. I think that was awesome. I really enjoyed that. Thanks, Rod. I appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge with us and to let everybody know. We'd love to have you back sometime in the future. It'd be great to learn a bit more as we go. So thanks for that. Appreciate it.
Anytime. Enjoy the pizza and beer, which I can't see.
Yeah, sorry, mate. You missed out on the pizza and drinks. Next thing for us will be we're doing a half day December the 3rd, Tuesday, December the 3rd, which is a little half day mini con. We've got Zoe Douglas from the Microsoft team coming over. We've got Darren Gosbell. We've got Kerry Kolosko, the data platform MVP, who does data visualization stuff. She's awesome. Daniel Marsh-Patrick, who invented Deneb. We've got a whole bunch of people all doing talks on Power BI and Fabric, all through like a half day. That'll be in the city at the Vivanti offices, which is our old Power BI haunt. So level 20 Collins Square. Definitely check that out. We're going to have. That'll probably be our last event for the year because that'll be our December event, and so then we'll kick off again in the new year with a bunch of stuff. Definity conference is happening in Sydney. That's Rez's conference. If you're interested in that, if you find yourself in Sydney, that's worth checking out. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in the Fabric world. They announced, so they've got fully fledged SQL databases in Fabric now. They just announced that literally last night. So that means you can have a full kind of not just analytics, but analytics and transactional and everything kind of experience. So all sorts of interesting things happening in this space. It's really cool tech. Definitely something to keep up with. And I think that's it. So thank you very much, Rod. Appreciate your time. And thanks everybody online. We'll see you soon.